Hello and welcome to another Otter History podcast with Otters here. This time the podcast is on the role of women in medicine through time, through the ages. Again, another smaller topic, but nonetheless very important and often crops up on the exam. So the first medical woman of note is somebody called Trotula, who taught at Salerno Medical School in the early 20th century. However, she seems to be a little bit of a blip in history because by the 14th century, women were not allowed to attend university and had therefore been largely driven out of the medical profession. They did continue to work as midwives during the Middle Ages, and of course, they also would often be housewife physicians, which is the fancy term for what would otherwise be known as the local wise woman, offering some herbal cures but also charms and spells. During the Middle Ages, there are some case studies to be aware of. For example, a lady known as Jacoba was put on trial in Paris for working without proper qualifications, but she argued, whilst on trial, that men wanted to put her on trial just because she'd been successful and taken away some of their business. In addition, a man named Dr. James Primrose complained in a book in 1651 that women went beyond their responsibilities if they attempted to be a physician, and that they would not understand medicine if they tried. Both cases suggest that in a male-dominated world, women had little place in the profession of medicine. It is important to note that it is difficult to know for sure about the role of women in medicine during the Middle Ages, as most sources were written by men and they were generally concerned with things such as laws, wars, or money, rather than writing about everyday life. However, it is reasonable to assume that women, apart from the local wise women, were unable to have much impact on medicine during the Middle Ages. In the interests of keeping your chronological understanding of what comes after what, I've included a section on the Renaissance. However, there's nothing in the textbook or any of the information provided by Excel which suggests anything significant happened with regards to women in medicine during the Renaissance. So we've got to assume that during the Renaissance things were very similar for women in medicine as they were during the Middle Ages. So we'll move on. So on to the Industrial Revolution, and the period of 1750 to 1900 was a period during which women became professionalised in medicine. This came as a general change in society and attitudes towards women. Nursing, certainly initially, was not seen as a respectable career in the early 19th century. Florence Nightingale's family were horrified when she announced that she wished to go into nursing, because she was from a very well-to-do family, don't you know. It wasn't until 1877 that women were able to study to qualify as doctors at university, largely due to the work of Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. And the two women that I've already mentioned are two of the most famous British women to ever have lived, and between them they led a revolution in attitudes towards women in the medical profession. So we'll start with Nightingale. Well, she went to the Crimean War of 1854 to 56 and worked in the Scutari Medical Hospital. Her insistence on hygiene on the wards led to a drop in the death rate at the hospital from an astonishing 42% of all the men brought to the hospital ended up dying to just 2%. Her work during the war was reported in the newspapers, probably because it was such an astonishing change, and led to Nightingale becoming famous. This newfound fame led to further developments. For example, the public contributed money that helped Nightingale to establish the Nightingale School for Nurses in London in 1860. She also published Notes on Nursing, which was translated into 11 languages. She wrote over 200 books on hospital design and organisation, and she was also influential in establishing a training school for midwives at King's College Hospital in London in 1861. What an incredible life. And she was closely followed, in chronological terms, by Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who came from a similar very well-to-do background to Nightingale, a very wealthy family. However, she didn't want to be a nurse, and took the unusual step, at the time, of attempting to become a doctor. She was repeatedly turned away from British medical schools, but that would not stop a lady like Garrett Anderson, who chose to learn French to a high enough standard to be able to learn to be a doctor in Paris, where it was allowed for William women to study for a medical degree. To me, that is absolutely incredible. I mean, it would be hard enough to study to be a doctor in the first place without having to learn to do it in a different language altogether. But she was not going to let barriers get in her way. Back in Britain, the Society of Apothecaries was the only one of the 3 medical bodies that didn't specifically state in its terms that they did not accept women, though no women were members. The Society of Apothecaries refused to accept Anderson when she applied, until Anderson's dad took them to court, when they were forced to admit Anderson into their ranks, before they then changed the rules and made it so women weren't allowed again. Undeterred, Anderson set up the New Hospital for Women in London in 1872. Then in 1874 she helped set up the London School of Medicine for Women in 1874, before finally the government passed an Act of Parliament allowing women to enter the medical profession legally. So she went against all odds and all of the legislation and the rules which said she shouldn't be a doctor. She even went and learned a different language so she could qualify, and managed to eventually get the government to pass an Act of Parliament so that other women could follow in her footsteps and take up a medical career. So Nightingale and Anderson in the Industrial Revolution had a colossal impact on women, going from being largely unknown to being professionalised and respected in medicine. And again, in the interests of chronological understanding, I've included a section on 1900 to modern day medicine, particularly the 20th century, and the role of women. Again, it doesn't specifically state anything in the textbook, but as a result of the work of Nightingale and Garrett Anderson in the latter part of the Industrial Revolution, more and more women turned to medicine. Nursing had become a respectable profession thanks to Nightingale, and women could become doctors thanks to Anderson. So more women took up medicine. Until now, you're just as likely to find a female doctor in your doctor's surgery as you are to find a male doctor. But most of the main changes occurred in the Industrial Revolution. And so ends our podcast on the changing role of women in medicine through time. And as you hopefully can see, they started off relatively unknown, mostly being wise women, doing the midwife work, and that stayed largely the same throughout the Middle Ages through to the Renaissance, and then until the dramatic impact of Florence Nightingale and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Hope that was useful. Good luck with your revision.